Thank you. All right, sorry we're getting started a little bit late. Good afternoon. Dr. Tyler Burge is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of California at Los Angeles. He is the author of numerous papers and books on philosophy of mind, history of philosophy, and epistemology, and has been featured in the New York Times. He is a member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences and the British Academy. Dr. Burge is perhaps best known for his writings on anti-individualism with respect to mental states, also known as externalism. His most recent book, Origins of Objectivity, provides key insights into the relationship between perception and representation, considered more broadly. It has been hailed by philosopher Robert Stalnaker as interdisciplinary philosophy at its best, drawing on a wealth of empirical research about human and animal perception, but keeping its eye on the philosophical issues, and with an unerring sense for the relevance of the empirical results to those issues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tyler Burge.
I need another one.
Yep, sorry.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to give it to you straight with no visual aids, so you'll just have to listen and think. Where does mind begin? This seems like a natural question. Rocks and fires floating in empty space are overwhelmingly the dominant large citizens of the universe. Most of us are confident that rocks and fires do not have minds. We humans have minds. Do any other terrestrial beings have minds? If so, which ones? When did they come on the scene? There's a philosophical question about how each of us knows that others have minds. That is not my question. I refuse to worry about whether other people have minds, at least not in this talk. I will not try to answer skeptics about mind in general or about knowledge of minds or how such knowledge is possible. I'm more interested in here in what we know than in skeptical questions about whether we know or how we know. I do have some sympathy with skepticism about whether some particular humans, certain politicians, for example, have minds. But I will not be dealing even with these skeptical questions. I will assume that we do have some knowledge that will help answer our question. My job is to explain that knowledge. So our question is, do other types of terrestrial animals have minds? If so, which ones? Most of us think that apes and dolphins have minds, and cats and dogs. The cats seem willful. The dogs seem to want to be with us. Both have eyes that seem to express mindfulness. And we hear all the time about how smart apes and dolphins are. Willfulness, wanting, expressiveness, smarts all seem to be signs of mind. What about birds with their bird brains? What of fish with their lifeless eyes? What of snakes with their robotic, mindless-seeming reflexes? What of spiders, ants, bees? The bees lack the endearing eyes that cats and dogs have. Like snakes, the bees and the spiders seem to act in pre-programmed ways. Their repertoire of behavior is limited. So maybe the insects lack minds. But the ants and bees do seem to cooperate in making and doing stuff. They seem to act in each other's interests. Aren't interests things that minds have? Spiders know how to spin webs and know how to get away when we threaten them. Surely knowledge is something that occurs in minds. Bees communicate with each other. Doesn't communication involve some mental state? So maybe bees and ants do have minds. What of worms? What of jellyfish? What of amoeba, paramecia, bacteria? They move around purposively and seem to find places where they thrive and avoid places where they do not thrive. They seem to know how to navigate. Purpose and knowing seem to be states of mind. Well, what of plants? Oh, come on, aren't we going overboard? But wait, plants grow in ways that are purposive and beneficial to them. And recently a biologist claimed in Scientific American that trees see. Surely seeing requires a mind. Are we being parochial and prejudicial to exclude trees and plants from having minds? Isn't saying that they lack minds just an expression of human smugness, a desire to be special? Why shouldn't purposeful growth count as a kind of planning and realization of self-interest? Why shouldn't knowledge and perception be ascribed to plants? But then there's a regularity and order in all of nature. Maybe that order is mindful or mind-like. Maybe the rocks like to move in the ways they do. Maybe the fires enjoy dancing. Do rocks and fires have minds after all? Somewhere in this line of questioning, it is easy to feel that things have gotten out of hand. Some of the questions seem silly, but it's also easy to feel that many of the questions aren't easy. People disagree about how to answer them. Even whether there's agreement, it is not easy to say why we agree. Are the right answers just a matter of cultural habit or choice? Are they relative to what one feels for or cares for? Are they just a matter of what stance one decides to take up toward other beings in the universe? I think not. I think there are definite answers based on scientific knowledge to these questions about which animals have minds and what things are mindless. In asking the questions, one is likely, if one is honest, to feel uneasy. What is one asking exactly? What is mind? Is one so sure of what one means? Is it so evident what mind is? If the meaning of the question is unclear, how can we even begin to answer it? For all that, there remains a sense that the initial question is a real question and that it should have a real answer. Philosophy takes up large, interesting-sounding questions that, on reflection, need to be clarified before they can be well answered. Commonly, philosophy must worry about the meaning of its questions. At the same time, it tries to develop answers to those very questions. That seems like a paradox to some. How can one answer a question that one doesn't understand? Well, let's begin by noticing that a lot of our thinking involves terms or concepts that we do not understand very well. Many of us talk about semiconductors, or electric fields, or radio waves, or lymphomas. We understand these terms well enough to use them, but most of us cannot explain them in any depth. So the first thing to remember here is that it is not so uncommon to ask questions that we don't understand very well. Part of finding the answer is improving our understanding of terms in our questions or concepts. Questions about mind are like that. But don't we need definitions to ask a serious question about what individuals have minds? People often ask philosophers, what is your definition for this or that? Here the question might be, what's your definition of mind? Well, philosophers rarely give definitions. They're not shirking their duty. Definitions are not what they're commonly cracked up to be. In fact, we know from some very good work in philosophy by Quine and Putnam that useful definitions are not secure starting places. They can incorporate mistaken theories, and even when they're invoked in science, they're open to questioning and improvement. To be useful, definitions must capture something we already understand. To be accurate, they must accord with facts. They do not come for free. In fact, they belong, if anywhere, more toward the end of inquiry than at the beginning. How are we to attack our problem? I will start with some very general remarks about mind. These remarks will serve to limit our problem and focus it in a way that science can help both sharpen our question, where does mind begin, and point to a partial answer. Mind is not a well-entrenched scientific term. Ordinary speech allows quite a range of applications. My initial discussion brings out how unsteady ordinary talk is when it comes to deciding whether certain animals have minds. We say that worms know things, that safety is downward into the earth, and want things to be left alone, but we also see worms as mindless organisms driven by their biological programs. The tradition of reflecting on mind in philosophy can, I think, help. The tradition is focused on two large features, each of which has been taken to be a mark of mind. Some philosophers have taken all minds to involve both features. Others have favored one over the other. The two large features are consciousness and representation. Consciousness needs little introduction. It is what it's like to be awake. Notice, no definition. There are unconscious aspects of mind, of course. In fact, most of what goes on in our minds is unconscious. But the unconscious parts serve the conscious parts. and an individual that's not capable of being conscious counts for some philosophers as lacking a mind. So for many philosophers, being capable of consciousness is a mark of having a mind. I will not be saying much about consciousness, though I will return to it at the end. I won't say much because although a lot of philosophy and some of science has gone into studying consciousness, consciousness is not very well understood. We do not know where in the evolutionary process consciousness begins. We can be confident that we are conscious, that apes, monkeys, dolphins, whales, dogs, and cats are conscious. We can be confident because we know that consciousness depends in some way on the brain. For example, sensory centers like pain centers. And we know that these animals have brains that are similar enough to ours to infer they have consciousness. They feel pain. We do not know whether insects or worms are conscious. In fact, we do not yet know how to determine scientifically whether they're conscious. The other large feature of mind is representation, and I'm going to focus on representation. The term representation is used in several ways. I want to clarify a use that centers on a distinctively psychological or mental kind. Okay, here comes some technical stuff which I'll unpack slowly. Representational psychological states are those that have veridicality conditions as an aspect of their natures. Let me provide some commentary on the ideas in this point. First, veridicality conditions. Veridicality is being right about a subject matter. Veridicality has two main species, accuracy and truth. I use the term truth for the veridicality of propositions. Propositions, or propositional representational contents, are simply things that can be true or false and that have the same structure as complete sentences or complete thoughts. We used to say that a sentence is an expression of a complete thought. I'm working on that same sort of idea. I use the term accurate, so truth is one species of veridicality. Accuracy is the other. I use the term accurate for veridicality that is not propositional. Symbols that are accurate or inaccurate are drawings and maps. I take perceptions to be examples of psychological states that do not have propositional structure and that are accurate or inaccurate but not true or false. A veridicality condition is a condition for being right about a subject matter. A representational content is such a condition. If the condition is fulfilled, the representational content, whether it be propositional or non-propositional, is veridical. If the condition is not fulfilled, then the content is not veridical. A propositional representational content is true or false. For example, a belief that dolphins are friendly to humans has a truth condition. That is, a propositional representational content that is fulfilled if dolphins are in fact friendly to humans and not fulfilled otherwise. Since representational contents are kinds of psychological states, the associated kind of psychological state, in this case the belief, is true or false as well. Similarly, a non-propositional representational content sets a condition for being accurate about a subject matter. If the condition is met, the content and the associated perception are accurate. If the condition is not met, they are not. For example, a perception of something as spherical is accurate if that something is spherical. Otherwise, the perception is not accurate. So much for exposition of the notion of veridicality condition. The rest of my explication of the term representational holds that to be representational, a state must have veridicality conditions as an aspect of its nature. Nearly any state can be treated instrumentally as if it had veridicality conditions. Doing so enables us to treat states as psychological or mental when we do not think they really are. We can say that a planet wants to get around the sun in the usual way, and its wish is fulfilled, made true if it does so. Bacteria can be treated as more or less accurately representing light or oxygen, and as knowing light or oxygen to be harmful and wanting to get away from them. Treating bacterial states as if they had veridicality conditions can be useful, but treating them that way does not make it so. In the psychologies of some individuals, having veridicality conditions is an aspect of the natures of those states, the kinds of states they are. A scientific understanding of the states themselves invokes veridicality conditions. The laws that the states figure in are specifiable in terms of veridicality conditions. Science does not explain bacterial movement in terms of veridicality conditions. Bacteria do not think or perceive. Science does explain the formation of certain psychological states, most impressively perceptual states, in terms of veridicality conditions. Certain animals have veridicality conditions, representational states, as real aspects of their psychologies. As noted, it is often convenient, though metaphorical, to invoke veridicality conditions in a description of a phenomenon. Some have taken veridicality conditions as simply a status, accorded those states for purposes of someone who describes the states. Such a view is skeptical that veridicality conditions or representation, in the strong sense that I've laid out, are real psychological kinds. Such a view holds that representationality is, in general, a matter of our stance toward a state. Dennett held this view a good while ago. Not a real feature of the state. The instrumentalist position just sketched is incompatible with the usual realist view of science. Science invokes representation as a kind embedded in law-like patterns. The most developed science of this sort is perceptual psychology. Other parts of psychology appeal to states with veridicality conditions as well. So there is empirical reason to take representation, in my strong sense, as a real kind in the world. Another more common way of avoiding appeal to the notion of representation that I've outlined is to substitute for it certain other notions, also commonly expressed with the word representation, that are also present in scientific explanations. I shall call this family of notions information registration, but this family of notions is often called representation. It's okay to call it representation, but it's not what I'm talking about. So I'm going to use a different term here, information registration. The core of this family is the technical notion of Shannon information. In this sense of information, one state X gives information about another state Y if X is statistically correlated with Y to some relevant degree. Thus, if workers getting off from work in China is correlated with a cock's crowing in Nova Scotia, statistically, then each gives information about the other. And it can be said on the relevant usage that one type of event represents the other. Clearly, this notion of information as statistical correlation is not the same notion as the notion of representation that I'm explicating. My notion is distinctively associated with psychology. The former notion is an all-purpose notion of regular correlation. Sometimes the information theoretic notion, together perhaps with a causal notion, is adjoined to a notion of biological function. The result is often also termed representation. Thus, for state X to represent state Y in this sense, X must not only correlate with Y and be causally dependent on Y, X must also have a biological function of correlating with Y. This conjunction of notions still is vastly more inclusive than the notion of representation that I began with. A plant's growing in a certain direction correlates with and is caused by and functions to correlate with the direction of the sun. But the plant states do not represent the direction of the sun in any psychologically distinctive sense. One can call the correlation causal functional complex representation if one wants, and it's actually rampant in the biological sciences to do so. but one is not using a psychologically distinctive notion of representation. No science explains the plant's growth in terms of its having states with veridicality conditions as aspects of their natures. They are purely biological processes. Many of the sensitivities of plants and other organisms have been illuminatingly explained in terms of information registration. Many biologists and philosophers use the term representation very broadly to comprise all information registration. Doing so curries interest. It's sexier and gets more headlines to say that the bacterium represents oxygen and knows how to get away from it, or that the tree sees the sun. But nothing genuinely about veridicality conditions enters into the account. No representation in a psychologically distinctive sense is in play. Even explanations in the science that use some notion of information registration do not use the notion in explaining the function and the formation and processing of states. The notion enters only into background functional explanation, an account of what the biological structures are for in survival of the organism. The basic states and processes of the plant are explained in biochemical terms or structural terms that are not in any ordinary sense psychological. No science takes the plant's internal states to have accuracy or truth conditions with distinctive structures and semantics. Accuracy does not feature in the biology of plant processes. One should not confuse the information registration sense of representation with the psychological sense of the same word. The extreme breadth of the application of the information registration notions indicates that they differ in significant ways from the notion of representation that has traditionally been thought to be involved in perception, belief, language, and reasoning. I'm going to skip some stuff. There is, however, a scientific difference between information registration and representation, properly so called. In genuine representation, or if you want, distinctively psychological representation, veridicality conditions play a role in actual scientific explanations. They play such a role most impressively in perceptual psychology. The point of perceptual psychology is to explain causally how individuals perceive particulars and attributes in the physical environment and under what conditions individuals fall into illusions. This form of explanation has been present in psychology since Helmholtz's work in the 19th century, but it's become the centerpiece of mathematically rigorous, systematic work that's become a mature science since the early 1970s. The science of visual perception has become a more impressive science than many parts of biology, including many parts of neuroscience. Since science is perhaps the best basis for judging what sorts of things there are in the world, there is powerful reason to believe that representation involving veridicality conditions as a key and apparently ineliminable feature is a basic psychological kind. Representationally successful perception is perception that is accurate about an environmental subject matter. Perceptual illusion is inaccuracy about a subject matter. States that are capable of being accurate or inaccurate about a subject matter are postulated in perceptual psychology, both as things to be explained and as factors in causal explanations of other perceptual states. Representation, in the sense that I've outlined, lies at the center of a mature, rigorous science. Of course, it's an empirical question whether one kind of scientific explanation can be reduced to another. But reductions must be earned. It is not acceptable simply to assume a reduction. I believe that there are systematic reasons why reduction of representation to any of the types of information registration that figure in science is unlikely. I will not go into detail here. I will just sketch the main idea. The nearest thing to the notions of accuracy and error in the suite of ideas that comprise various types of information registration are notions of fulfillment or failure to fulfill biological function. Success in realizing a biological function is a practical matter, fitness for survival, or fitness for surviving long enough to mate. But truth, accuracy, falsity, and inaccuracy are not practical matters. In principle, biological success could be correlated with inaccuracy all the way down, and biological failure could be correlated with accuracy all the way down. Error can contribute to fitness. A rabbit's repeated misperceptions of danger might not only ensure against capture by erroneous quick-trigger reactions, its expenditure of energy in acting on those misperceptions could make it more adept at fleeing. Similarly, accurate representation can contribute to failure of fitness, to be sure mostly at the higher levels. Accepting truths about how things really are can lead to dysfunctional depression. The practical value of contribution to fitness is simply not the same as the representational value of veridicality. So a purported reduction, in effect, would change the subject. I've been making some references to the science of perceptual psychology. There appears to be no more primitive representational psychological state than perception. Perception is where representational mind begins. I will be trying to develop the commitments of perceptual psychology as a starting point for understanding this beginning. The basic point about perception is that it is a psychological state with veridicality conditions as part of its nature. That's my first point, already made. A second basic point about perception depends on knowing something more about perceptual psychology. I will say a little bit about the shape of the science. The central problem of perceptual psychology, paradigmatically visual psychology, is to explain causally how veridical perception and perceptual illusions are formed from sensory input. The science presupposes explanations in physics that connect environmental events with impacts on the sensory receptors. For example, visual psychology assumes the account in optics of how light is propagated from a surface of a certain size, shape, and reflectance, and in a certain position, to impacts on sensory receptors. The optical laws of light as it projects from a surface to a certain array of frequencies as they strike the retinal receptors are well understood. The psychological account has two main forms. One explains a causal chain of states that begins with the registration of the inputs into the visual system. For example, the first effect of the light array on the retinal sensors, and ends with perceptual states that represent the environment as being certain ways. The second form of the account explains how light reflecting off environmental entities yields perceptual states. This second form combines the first form, which basically starts at the surface of the perceiver and goes inward. The second form starts with the environmental entities and goes inward. Second form combines the first form with the background assumption of the optics. This second form enables psychological science to explain accurate perception and illusion. Explanation of this sort can both anticipate general environmental conditions under which perception will be accurate or inaccurate and explain successful perception and illusion in particular cases. What makes both forms of explanation difficult and interesting is what is known in the science as the underdetermination problem. Visual perception represents particulars and attributes in the environment, but the initial states of the perceptual system are sensory registrations of proximal stimulation. Proximal stimulation is stimulation closest to the sensory receptors. Such registrations of light arrays impacting the retina are not perceptions, but these and other registrations are all that the visual system has to go on. Different environmental conditions can produce the same registrations of proximal stimulation. So in this sense, proximal stimulations do not determine their environmental causal antecedents, the entities that are perceptually represented. Correspondingly, the registrations of proximal stimulation underdetermine perceptual states that are accurate or inaccurate with respect to the environment. That is, a given registration of proximal stimulation is in itself compatible with many possible perceptual states. So there are two types of underdetermination that confront the central explanations of perceptual psychology. One is underdetermination of the environmental objects of perception by registration of proximal stimulation. The other is underdetermination of perceptual states by the registration of proximal stimulation. The underdetermination problem is that of answering the following question. How are perceptual states that represent specific particulars and attributes in the environment produced, given that the proximal stimulations to which the system has immediate causal access do not determine either the environmental entities that the perceptual states represent as being there, or the perceptual states that do the representing? The initial registration, or encoding, of proximal stimulation, mainly registration of light, goes through a series of transformations in the visual system that eventuate in perceptual representations that represent entities in three-dimensional space. There's a determinate optical and geometrical solution to the problem of determining how a three-dimensional array projects onto a two-dimensional coding of that array, but there's no determinate mathematical solution to how a two-dimensional coding is transformed into a representation of a three-dimensional scene. The retinal encodings, together with all other input from proximal stimulation, underdetermine even the physically possible environmental causes. Perceptual states sometimes, however, accurately specify environmental attributes and refer to environmental particulars that have such attributes. So perceptual psychology must discover laws that govern how registrations of proximal stimulation cause visual perceptions through a series of transformations. These formation laws are distinctively psychological. They systematically cite representational states in terms of the accuracy conditions of the states. For example, a perceptual state that specifies surface or body X as farther away by such and such a distance from surface or body Y. The perception laws and law-like patterns of processing in effect privilege certain possible environmental causes over others. The effect of the privileging is that the underdetermining registration of the proximal stimulation triggers, through a series of transformations, a perceptual state that represents exactly one of the many possible environmental causes that are optically compatible with the incoming light and its registration. The underdetermination of environmental causes by proximal registrations renders the formation of perceptual states subject to error. Illusions occur when abnormal, unprivileged environmental causes produce the same types of registration of proximal stimulations that are produced by normal, privileged distal causes. These conditions are the topic of the science. The foregoing discussion of the underdetermination problem grounds my second point about perception. The point is this: formation of perceptual states constitutes a certain type of objectification. Given that a process yields a perceptual state that specifies, that is, has accuracy conditions regarding environmental entities, formation of perceptual states involves a type of objectification. This objectification is formation of a state that functions to represent a subject matter beyond idiosyncratic features of the individual. The subject matter is the physical environment. The objectification involves a certain removal from the local or idiosyncratic. Objectification resides in the ways perceptual systems overcome the two forms of underdetermination. The perceptual system distinguishes patterns of sensory registration that are likely to be adventitious or idiosyncratic to the perceiver or abnormal from patterns that tend to correlate with specific aspects of the environment. When perceptual processing yields representation of the physical environment, it constitutes the relevant objectification. The sensory registration is local and idiosyncratic. The perceptual states represent a reality beyond proximal stimulation. Objectification in perception is implemented by what are called perceptual constancies. This is a term from the science. Perceptual constancies are perceptual capacities systematically to represent some given particular or attribute as that very particular attribute under significant variations in registration of proximal stimulation. In a perceptual constancy, a perceptual system represents some given aspect of the physical environment as that aspect from different perceptual perspectives produced by different proximal stimulations. For example, shape constancy is the capacity to perceive a given shape under various stimulus and perspectival conditions. A rectangular pattern can be seen as rectangular, whether viewed head-on or at an angle. It's not a matter of background knowledge either. It's something that perceptual systems automatically do. Luminance constancy is the capacity to represent a given luminance on the scale from black to white as the same under various stimulus conditions, including radically different illuminations. There are numerous types of perceptual constancies. Perceptual constancies are marks of objectification. I conjecture that a sensory system is perceptual if and only if the system includes perceptual constancies. The idea of the conjecture is that the central aspect of perceptual systems is that makes it necessary to explain formations of their states in terms of representational contents with accuracy conditions is the presence of perspectival capacities inherent in perceptual constancies. My conjecture is that in the actual world, in the absence of perceptual constancies, a system's ability to connect sensorily with the environment can be adequately explained in terms that do not make representational, reference to representational contents with accuracy conditions. As a matter of scientific fact, explanations of many sensory capacities do not need to and do not invoke representational contents that set accuracy conditions. So explanations of this sort do not ascribe perceptual constancies. I believe that this difference in explanatory strategy corresponds to a difference in sensory capacities between those that involve perceptual constancies and those that do not. Representational accuracy and perceptual constancy are natural psychological kinds acknowledged in the science. As I've intimated, many species exhibit perceptual constancies. Some arthropods, bees, locusts, and some spiders. Most reptiles, amphibians, and fish, and probably all birds and mammals have visual perception. Most of the spatial constancies occur in these visual systems. Color constancy is scattered through the animal kingdom, apparently depending on how central color is in the life of the species. Birds and bees tend to have it. Many mammals appear to lack it. We are fortunate. Object constancy has been demonstrated in many birds and mammals. Various aspects of touch, proprioception, and hearing are perceptual, again in a wide variety of animals. Since certain arthropods have perception, and since perception involves the most primitive type of representation, these animals have the most primitive type of representational mind. Representational mind begins with bees, spiders, locusts, and praying mantises. Let me summarize my overall argument. Perception is a natural psychological kind recognized in a rigorous, mature science. Perception is marked by having accuracy conditions as part of the nature of the kind. The formation of perception involves a type of objectification. This objectification is a process that systematically contrasts phenomena that encode proximal stimulation at various levels of abstraction and phenomena that systematically represent specific environmental entities. Objectification is marked by processes embedded in perceptual constancies. These are perceptual capacities to represent some environmental particular attribute as that particular attribute under a large variety of proximal stimulations and from a large variety of corresponding perspectives. The simplest animals that are known to exhibit perceptual constancies are bees, certain spiders, and other arthropods, such as locusts and praying mantises. So they have perceptual capacities. Perceptual capacities constitute the most primitive sort of representational mind, so representational mind begins in the arthropods. I return to the other mark of mind, consciousness. In our current state of knowledge, I see no point in wrangling over priority between consciousness and representation. I think it better to follow out each of these marks of mind to see where it leads. We may come to think that our concept of mind straddles importantly different kinds, representation and consciousness. Or we may come to understand some sort of unity between the two primary marks. In any case, it is not a scientific requirement on perception that it be conscious. We know that bees and spiders have perception. We do not know whether they are conscious. Moreover, there is empirical reason to believe that some perception in bees and in us is unconscious. Further, not all consciousness involves perception, or even, I think, representation. Awareness of the felt quality of pain, as distinguished from proprioceptive locating of pain in the body, does not require representational content or perceptual constancies. There may be organisms that feel pain and hence are conscious, but lack any representational capacities. There may be organisms that have representational capacities, but are never conscious. We do not know where consciousness begins. For example, we do not know where awareness of pain begins in the animal world. We do not know enough about consciousness even to know how to directly investigate the matter. So we do not know where conscious mind begins. But we do know where representational mind begins. It begins with the arthropods. This result may not make us feel any special kinship with insects. They do not make good pets. They do not love or appreciate us. They lack endearing eyes. But we do have this in common. We're both capable of representing aspects of the physical environment in a distinctively psychological sense of represent. We both have representational mind. In this respect, we're part of a small minority in this universe dominated by rock and fire. And we differ importantly from another minority with which we share life, the plants and other pre-psychological organisms. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, I think we have time for maybe one or two questions, and then we're going to have a 15-minute break before the keynote in the other room.
Recognize the word verticality. Spell it. Spell the word verticality.
V-E-R-I-D-A-L-I-T-Y.
You missed the items.
What? It's the noun that goes with veridical.
So what role do you give to symbolic representations
They come along later, as far as I can tell. I don't think there's any evidence that symbols are playing some role in the mind of insects, unless you sort of trivially say whatever the sort of neural basis counts as a symbol. But I don't think the psychological science makes use of symbols. So down that far, symbols aren't playing any role. We need to get clear about exactly what counts as a symbol. So it may show up with the higher mammals, for example. Linguistic symbols, I think, in a strict sense, don't appear in any other animals but humans. So I'm inclined to think symbolic expression of mind is a fairly late development. Well, I think consciousness is probably pretty primitive. My guess is that consciousness is much earlier than symbols. Self-consciousness, yes, that may be something that's, if we can make it clear exactly what we're talking about there, I'm inclined to think self-consciousness is a candidate for something that goes along with language or comes quite late, perhaps only with human beings. Yes?
I just had a couple of questions to clarify some of the terminology. I'd never heard that word either. But the way you explained it, it seemed like it's very closely correlated with just like soundness versus validity. Like you have the internal validities, and then you have the true values of validities as they actually make sense.
Well, soundness and validity have to do with connections among representational contents that have veridicality conditions.
Okay.
So soundness and validity have to do with arguments, whereas you can think of veridicality as having to do, at least propositional veridicality, truth has to do, is a property of the steps in the arguments.
Okay. And
Right.
one more thing, in regards to the pain, I guess, awareness of pain, and you were referring to animals. Is that, you didn't say specifically, or maybe you did, but my understanding is the suffering element of pain, is that what you were referring to?
No, just the felt quality. I think suffering is probably a functional upshot from pain. The felt quality itself is what I think that's enough for consciousness. Whether you suffer from the pain or enjoy it is sort of
separation between the brainstem reaction and say like the reaction you get from the amygdala in regards to like whether it's a fight or flight response or whether it's not a fight or flight response.
Yeah, okay. Right. So I want the very most primitive aspect of pain to be enough for consciousness. That's my conjecture anyway. Yeah.
So I was just going to clarify. So you think it's we need this kind of perceptual consistency for there to be this kind of veridicality of the state, right? And this is what the spiders actually have.
Yes. Right.
Do you think that consistency is necessary?
It's constancy. Constancy. Perceptual constancy.
Yeah. So that's necessary and able to have.
That's a conjecture. That's a philosophical conjecture. What the scientists don't think in these sort of broad terms, but the constancies are a central aspect of the science. And various people say, Stephen Palmer, who's a vision scientist here, is said in many publications it's a very central aspect of perception. I've gone slightly farther. I say it's the essential aspect of perception. Yeah.
Sort of just going off of that, I was also curious, how do you prove that any form of perception meets verticality conditions? Because, well, you have these perceptual constancies which you can look at and show like a rectangle looks like a rectangle no matter what angle, so that's sort of the accuracy condition. But what about truth? Because we have a hard time measuring truth. How do we know that any of our perception is based off of what's really there?
That's a skeptical question, which I'm going to ignore. I take it. I mean, I don't mean it quite that. I mean, in terms of my talk, I'm ignoring it. I'm assuming that science sometimes produces a truth, or at least approximate truth. How do we determine? We use science, and everything else we can. And of course, there are philosophical skeptics that raise questions about how do we know science, how can we justify science? And I know a lot about that problem and have thought a lot about it, but it's not one that worries me. It seems to me it's a kind of philosophical puzzle, but I don't stay up awake at night worrying about whether science gives us approximate truths. So I'm taking that as a starting point. So you're right, the science, unlike the insects, can kind of look at both the insects and the world and ask, well, how well are the insects matching up to the world under lots of different perspectival conditions? And the science is assuming that the world is a certain way, and we know what kind of way it is. I'm comfortable with that.
I guess I was just sort of confused about the distinction between representation and information registration, because the representation sort of took as a given that the perceptions met the verticality conditions, right? And the information registration was just sort of taking in the information and integrating it, right? So, like, what is actually the difference if you can't actually measure truth?
We do, I don't know about measuring truth, but we determine truth in science. What's that?
Determining that it's accurate.
You say we can't determine truth. I say we can. I think you just don't believe in science, or else you think of science as some sort of...
I believe that, like, senses are fallible, memory is fallible.
Yes, that's right. Part of the perceptual theory is to explain under what conditions perception goes wrong. So it's certainly part of the science to recognize perception on which science is based can go wrong. We try to understand under what conditions it goes wrong so as to limit the fallibility. Yes?
Yes, my question is sort of continuing with your perceptual constancies. Do you think it could have evolved itself in a world which we're living in, and if we were to actually experiment with, for example, we do an experiment in spacelessness with an insect or some animal or ourselves, that could actually change our representation itself and our psychological that the perceptual constancy itself is a function of the environment?
Yes, of course. Yes, these states got molded by the environment. I don't think accuracy is selected for. I think natural selection is a practical matter. It's getting by. But I think accuracy came about as a result. It obviously did evolve, even though it might not have been directly selected for. And it's certainly true that it's part of this doctrine of anti-individualism that Dana referred to. It's deeply part of my view that the meanings of these states, the accuracy conditions, are made what they are through bumping up against the environment.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but I'm sure Dr. Burge would be happy to talk.
Sure, I'd love to talk more.